Welcome once again to the Vidrash, and we've got a very interesting question today. We're going to get right to it. All right, John S. writes, "Our local fellowship has been caught up in the teaching of tongues as doctrine from the standpoint that it is an unknown tongue that results in a person claiming to be overcome with a message from God that results in an unintelligible utterance, in which the claim is someone must be gifted in interpretation. The leadership of our fellowship is claiming that there are 5 Sabbath-keeping groups that are currently entertaining that same perspective, and Bill Cloud is one of them, and yet we find no evidence of him acknowledging this perspective. Can you please clear this up for us?" Well, first of all, yes, I believe that the gift of tongues is still valid. I believe it's still in operation. I believe that other spiritual gifts are for today. For example, the word of knowledge. So I believe that. But I also believe that gifts, including tongues, have at times been abused, misused, and consequently misunderstood, maybe even shunned. Furthermore, at Jacob's tent, we don't set gifts of the Spirit before us as our ultimate goal. That's not, our primary pursuit. We strive to produce the fruit of the Spirit. In part, the gifts are supplied to the body in order to do that is to produce the fruit. Here's what Paul has to say on the matter. This is in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. He says, "The manifestation of the Spirit is given to each one for the profit of all. For to one is given the word of wisdom through the Spirit, to another the word of knowledge through the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healings by the same Spirit, to another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another discerning of spirits, to another different kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues. But one and the same Spirit works all these things, distributing to each one individually as he wills." So here are a few thoughts on the matter as we try to relate to you how we stand on this. Paul makes it very clear that everyone is to benefit from the gifts, even if not everybody receives the same gift. It's God who decides what gift he wants to give and to who he wants to give that particular gift, and maybe more than one. Furthermore, in this same letter, Paul encouraged us to desire spiritual gifts, and he didn't single out one over the other necessarily, although we'll kind of underscore that in just a moment. But he said that we are to pursue love. That is, to pursue the love of God, to pursue the love of our fellow man. Now, when it comes to tongues, Paul said different kinds of tongues, which to me suggests he's talking about, he's saying that there are different kinds, and that doesn't mean they are all unknown. They might be unknown to some, but they might be known to others. And to that point, the first New Testament occurrence of people speaking in tongues was in Acts chapter 2. And if you read the text, it's very clear that all these people were speaking in what may have been unknown to them, but were known tongues. In fact, it says, in every language under heaven. So there was somebody there who understood the wonderful works of God were being spoken in their tongue. So I only say that to dispel the misconception that some have that the gift of tongues is exclusively referring to speaking in an unintelligible utterance, as it was posed to us in the question. Now, when it comes to tongues, Paul clearly acknowledged that gift. He even claimed to have that gift. He desired that everyone would have that gift. However, it's also very clear that he esteemed prophecy above tongues because, put very simply, the gift of prophecy allows everybody to understand what's being said and how we're being encouraged. And the entire congregation is going to be edified if somebody has the gift of prophecy. So this is one of the reasons, frankly, that we don't emphasize tongues in our congregation. It's not put down, it's not suppressed, but we don't set this up as the goal to shoot for. We don't dismiss it, we don't disdain it. In fact, when it is authentic, the gift of tongues serves a purpose, one of which, as Paul said, is to edify the individual. And there is nothing wrong with that. In fact, every language, known and unknown, serves a purpose. And according to Paul, sometimes it is to be a sign to the unbeliever. But in our pursuit of any of the spiritual gifts, it should be, and this is what Paul makes very clear, it should be with the edification and the encouragement of the entire congregation in mind. Paul said this, "I thank my God I speak with tongues more than you all. Yet in the church I would rather speak 5 words with my understanding, that I may teach others also, than 10,000 words in a tongue." Now, when it comes to those who are unbelievers or those who are skeptical of the gift of tongues, Paul also makes this very clear. If everybody in the congregation just started speaking in tongues, and then somebody who had no understanding of what this was all about just happened to walk in on this, what would they think? Well, Paul said they'd think you're crazy, you're out of your mind, or some people might think, well, these people are demon-possessed. That's essentially the argument that Paul made. And that brings us to this point. Paul said, and he taught, that the gift of tongues, when it was appropriated improperly, creates confusion. And that is what has happened through the years. I grew up in a Pentecostal church, a tongue-talking church. And I can tell you, growing up in that environment, this kind of confusion that can happen, it happened. And in my experience, more often than not, I would even say that in my experience, because such a premium was placed on tongues and interpretation, there were a lot of people that were left thinking that that's what they were supposed to do, that this was the goal to shoot for. And I believe it led some people, and I would add to that, people who were well-intentioned, people who love God, people who were not intentionally trying to mislead or create confusion. But I do believe it led people to think that because this is the goal to shoot for, they practiced learned behavior. And that's what created a lot of confusion, uncertainty, even skepticism. However, that doesn't mean that the gift of tongues is illegitimate. It does not. It just means that, as we've been witnessed from the very beginning of time, we don't always understand and we don't always properly appropriate the gifts that God has given to us. I would suggest that it takes time, growth, maturity to really appreciate the gift. And I would add wisdom to that. And if anybody lacks wisdom, he should ask God. And so all these things are very important when it comes to appreciating the gifts that God has given to us, whatever that gift is. And it doesn't have to be the gift of tongues. The evidence of that maturity will be the fruit that is evidenced in that person, and I would say in the congregation at large. Now, when it comes to the interpretation of tongues, Paul acknowledged that this too was a spiritual gift. And it came in quite handy when there was a tongue in the congregation that no one understood. Moreover, he said if someone spoke in a tongue and there was no interpretation, that after 2 or 3 times, that person was to be quiet. And if they continued to speak in that tongue, it should be silently to themselves. Because apparently, and this is reading between the lines, that tongue wasn't for everybody. That encouragement, that edification wasn't for everybody. Maybe just for that individual. In fact, whether we're referring to tongues or other matters, just because God gives it to us doesn't mean that it's for everybody at that particular time. Sometimes it's just for us. It's not for everybody. And that requires us to be discerning, which is another attribute of maturity and wisdom. So all of this kind of leads me to why we don't emphasize tongues so much. We don't suppress it. We don't restrain it, but we don't put it at the front. This is what we're all shooting for. It's because, and this is what Paul really gets into, he was expressing a desire that there would be order in the congregation, not chaos. Whether someone had the gift of tongues or the gift of prophecy, here's what he said. The spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, of shalom. Therefore, brethren, desire earnestly to prophesy. And listen to this, do not forbid to speak with tongues. let all things be done decently and in order. And to that I say, amen.